25 years ago, I made a series of films about wine that saw me travel the world, building up into a history, which then became a book. Today, I thought I'd revisit it and cut it up into bite-sized chunks for you to view exclusively online. I hope you enjoyed viewing them as much as I enjoyed making them. Wine is a paradox. It's a simple natural food. It's even simpler than bread in a way because it doesn't need cooking. And yet it's a substance so special that a single bottle of it can fetch as much as a great work of art. For all its complexities, though, it is still made in its most natural form in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, where its history began.
The making of wine goes back into the mists of prehistory. Here in Georgia, in the foothills of the Caucasus, are lush green valleys with an amazingly rich and diverse plant life. There are trees and climbers here that are found nowhere else. By rushing streams like this, grapevines grow wild. One of them, a species slightly different from all the others, is the wine grape, Vitis vinifera. This is where man first learnt that its juice, fermented, makes a drink, unlike all others. It was probably here that man first cultivated grapevines, as most Georgian farmers still do. Many farms are still as they must have been for thousands of years, small holdings run by a man and his family. One such man is Shota Sharashidze, who invited me to see Georgian winemaking in all its primeval innocence, the process at its simplest and most fundamental. It starts with all the family picking the grapes. Shota empties the baskets into a hollowed-out tree trunk. Then, after a scrupulous washing, which is perhaps not so traditional, he crushes the grapes with the instruments nature provided for the purpose. Finally, the crushed grapes, juice, skins, pips, stalks, everything, are drained off into a big clay jar called a quevri and simply left for nature to do its work.
Here are my quevris which are buried in the ground. This is my open-air wine cellar. I'll open one for you. This wine hasn't quite finished fermenting. It's a new wine, but there is also a mature wine here. This is the kope made from a gourd. It's used for scooping wine from the quevri.
It's like nothing I've tasted before, really. It's sharp, fizzy, it's got good strength, it's got a tremendous lot of flavour. Now, this is not like a modern wine that's gone through a winery at all. It's got guts, I would say.
Between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, wine left its cradle of origin, the Caucasus Mountains, and began its long journey towards Europe and the rest of the world.
Wine and wine growing were exported down the great rivers that flow south from the Caucasus, the Euphrates and the Tigris, to the powerful cities of the earliest civilizations, Babylon and Ur. The wine came downstream in big tub-like boats called hufars or coracles. Similar craft was still in use on these rivers within living memory, and coracles, very like these, only smaller, are still made by the traditional method of weaving willow branches, like a large wicker basket covered with animal hides. The wine was in barrels, by far the earliest barrels that we know of. All we can say about its quality is that it satisfied the courtiers of Ur. This representation of them, done in semi-precious stones, is the first picture of wine drinking ever found. It is 4,500 years old.
The passion for winemaking really began to take hold in the ancient world. A historian said that civilization came when men began to plant the vine and the olive tree. As more complex cultures began to cultivate vines, they left behind them more and more graphic evidence of what it looked like.
It doesn't come as a surprise that wine was an important part of the most sophisticated of all the ancient civilizations, Egypt. The valley and delta of the River Nile provided very good conditions for growing grapes. These tomb paintings show every step in the process of making wine. These are clearly the grape pickers. Perhaps this is the foreman. This seems to be the measuring or recording of the crop on a clay tablet. Here the grapes are being trodden, and this is a priestly offering, perhaps for a good harvest, which is being sealed up here in clay wine jars. Wine was clearly one of Egypt's great pleasures, both in this life and anticipated in the next. The Egyptians lavished luxuries on their dead. They thought the spirit of the dead man in this tomb would come out through this false door here to get at the food and wine that they'd left for him. And it wasn't just any wine, but wine labelled with the precise vineyard and often the date of the vintage and sealed up in a jar so that it could mature. This blue one says, "Wine of Osiris from the northern delta for the Lady Nejmet." Labels like these seem to show a remarkable degree of connoisseurship. They distinguish between different wines so precisely that they almost seem modern. It took the Burgundians nearly 1,000 years to start making such distinctions. But here were the Egyptians of 3,000 years ago, completely at home with wine and making the very most of it, even if, by modern standards, the wines of Egypt's torrid climate and irrigated fields could never have been what we would call good.